for the 50s class because they're the class that they're not sure how to handle it because they've been having over 50 coming out on Sunday morning. And some will come in, take a little time and say, oh, no thanks. We'll go to the auditorium. They can be tipping 60. Afterwards, see me. Which hand do you speak?
You ready? Love the fellowship, but let's get ready.
Sit down, Rollins.
So,
Sit down.
tonight we are on the subject of greed and money. And I've asked Scott Hankins if he would to lead us in a prayer. So let's bow in prayer.
God, we thank you for bringing us here this evening. We thank you for the day that you've given us to join each other and to fellowship and to study your word. We pray, Father, that the things that we learn tonight, the parts of your word that we can dig through, we will glean from and we can apply to our lives. We thank you, Father, for these times of worship and study. We pray that every time we gather, it will be pleasing to you. Please help us in our lives, Father, to apply the things that we learn from your word and show our light to this world of darkness. Bless us in all things, in Jesus' name. Amen.
So I was trying to think of what illustration of greed people can associate with as much as anything else. And I thought of a certain boxer named Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson supposedly went through $500 million in 15 years. And you wonder, how in the world could one person, in fact I have several that have said, how do you do that? How could one person go through 500 million in 15 years? So I have some of the numbers. $400,000 a month to maintain his current lifestyle. I think I could live on $400,000 a month. $9 million he spent in legal fees. $230,000 on cell phones and pagers. $410,000 on his own birthday party, and apparently that went up nearly every year. He spent $400,000 on purchasing 2 tigers and a bunch of pigeons, and he spent about that in maintaining them with care people and all that each year. So he paid an entourage of approximately 40 to travel with him, and the rumor mill is that he only knew 2 of the 40 at any given time. Had a fleet of luxury cars. He even bought cars for many others. My favorite story of his cars is he bought a Ferrari, a classic Ferrari, red Ferrari, for $1.4 million. And he drove it one time, and he threw the keys to one of his entourage, and that was that. His house that he was well known for was a 21-bedroom mansion, but on top of that one, he had 15 other houses. And at the end, he not only spent $500 million, but he also was $23 million in debt. I don't know what my wife would do if I told her that we are now $23 million in debt. I know what she would do, but so greed defined. Wayne's going to have here. Wayne, go ahead. Tell us what greed is. A definition.
First, you have to learn how to do this. I don't think that's on.
Up.
How about that?
The
Does green mean on?
green means on. Only an elder.
Well, first of all, defined by Webster, greed is an excessive desire for getting or having, especially wealth. It's a desire for more than one needs or deserves. The thing about greed is that it promises satisfaction, but never satisfies. Let me say that again. It promises satisfaction, but never satisfies. How's that, Carrie?
That's great. So, let's talk a second about the American dream. The American dream concept has been a driver of ambition. People are striving to be better than they have been in the past. To make more money, to have more significance. You know, if you think back, and I often use the illustration of Ecclesiastes. So the writer of Ecclesiastes is looking for something that will make him happy. And he tries wealth, and he tries power, and he tries good looks, and on and on and on. And at the end he says, the only two things that matter are fear God and keep his commandments. And when you think about it, I think the American people really kind of have a sickness. You get a boat, and that boat, 2 years after you get it, isn't quite big enough or quite fast enough or not compared to the neighbors. And then I read recently where Jeff Bezos bought a ship that's more like a cruise ship for somewhere around, I think it was 490 million or something like that. It carries 4 or 5 boats on it, and it's got this back ramp, and it's crazy. But do we ever get to a point where enough is enough? And the question for Christians, I think, a lot of time is, where does success and money play in part of our growth as a Christian? Does it or does it not? So one verse I told the guys I didn't want to steal from them, but I think really sums up in Scripture what we're talking about. Matthew 6:19 through 21 says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be also." And verse 24 says, "No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." So Wayne, share with us any verses or passages in the Old Testament that are focused on greed and money.
Typically, I'm not a panel guy, but I figured tonight, when there's nothing necessarily to defend, I think I'm ready. However, Carrie, I have to ask you the question, why put a miser on this particular panel, greed and money? I'm just asking. Okay. When you talk about the definition that Carrie has pretty well explained, greed is unrelenting. The only thing it wants is more. The goals of greed are unquantifiable and endlessly evasive. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 10, "He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. This too is futility. It's impossible to quench." God speaks to our wanting material things. He realizes the heart of man. He speaks to covetous feelings, to jealous desires, to selfish ambitions, to power, to self-fulfilling wants. Tracking this from Adam and Eve in the very beginning, through their 2 boys, Cain and Abel, through the prophets of the Old Testament and characters of the Old Testament, it tells much about the consequences of greed. And I have to ask the question as I was studying for this is, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with the numbers that Carrie has just provided? Can't we see the dangers and the evils of letting our wants take over and manipulate us? Because that's all it is. Sin evolves from greed and the want of things. Listen to this from Proverbs 11 and 28. "He who trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like the green leaf." Proverbs 14:31. "He who oppresses the poor reproaches his master, his maker, but he who is gracious to the needy honors him." 15 and 27. "He who profits illicitly troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live. 22 and 1, a good name is to be more desired than great riches. Favor is better than silver and gold. In other words, it's better to place our priorities on things other than greed or wants to satisfy us. I think of two occasions in the Old Testament that come to mind. One was in Genesis chapter 31. We won't read this one, but we all remember the story of Rachel as she stole the items from her father, Laban. Now some have said, well, that wasn't greed, but what was it if it wasn't greed? She took off and was caught in the process. There's also, secondly, a story in Judges chapter 17, verses 1 through 6. It's a happening we don't often associate with greed. An Old Testament character we don't even hardly remember a leading individual that he was in the Bible. But Micah had a problem, and let me read that very quickly. Now there was a man in the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Micah. He said to his mother, the 1,100 pieces of silver which were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse in my hearing, behold, the silver is with me. I took it. That's what it says. I took it. And his mother said, blessed be my son by the Lord. And he goes on and on and on. And then in verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. And guess what? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. We know that story from the Old Testament in many cases. Problem that Micah had was greedy, and it goes with some of us even today. No matter how we interpret the end result, greed seemed to rule the land at this time.
Gary, key passages in the life of Christ about greed and money.
Okay, thank you. Well, interestingly enough, greed, I didn't find it referenced only one time in the Gospels, and that was only in the ESV. So we don't find a whole lot about greed, but we do find the characteristics of greed very well defined and very well addressed by Jesus in his teachings. I'm going to be in Luke 11 for most of this particular part of my discussion. We'll be starting in verse 37 if you're following along. Jesus is speaking to a very large crowd, and he's dealing with a lot of the barbs and the shots and the things that the Pharisees are taking at him, along with others who are asking him questions to try to trap him. In the process of that, one of the Pharisees invites him in to eat with him. Starting in verse 37, while Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and reclined at the table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not wash and cleanse before dinner. And the Lord said to him, now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. This is the set of scriptures is one that many we're pretty familiar with. We're looking at it a little bit different in this context tonight. Jesus clearly identifies that greed is internal to man. It's a heart condition. It's what a man thinks, desires, and values that causes him to act in a particular manner. In the following verses, Jesus reminds the Pharisees that God made them perfectly. He made us all perfectly, both internally and externally. Furthermore, it's that we are pure in our thoughts and our values, and if we are, then our external actions will reflect that as well. In verse 40, speaking to the Pharisees, you fools, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But give as alms those things that are within, and behold, everything is clean for you. That is, if that inside is clean, right? Then everything that you do will be reflected. Jesus goes on to illustrate ways in which the Pharisees' personal values or greed are reflected by their actions. Verse 42, but woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Here he's pointing out that the Pharisees were very careful to demonstrate their personal giving at a micro level for show. But in showing the outward appearance of their generosity, they put very little into true justice for the oppressed, and they were certainly far from demonstrating God's love for others. I'm going to take a part of Micah, as Wayne was just talking about, a different portion of it that is tied to what Jesus just said to them. Micah in chapter 6, verses 7 and 8 said, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Which is exactly what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees. In verse 43, woe to you Pharisees, for you love the best seat in the synagogue and the greetings in the marketplace. Woe to you, for you are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without knowing it. In Matthew 23 and verse 7, Jesus also said that they were like whitewashed tombs. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full and dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. When I read that about you're like an unmarked grave, I was going, I don't really understand that. I don't understand that reference. But if you go back to Numbers 19, in the book of Numbers, we find where the children of Israel are told how to purify and make clean the remains of people who have died. And it talks about if you touch the bones or if you do this or that, you're unclean, and what you have to do ceremoniously to become clean again from that. So the point being, well, if you read Numbers, verse 20 in chapter 19, it says, if the man who is unclean does not cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the midst of the assembly, since he has defiled the sanctuary of the Lord, because the water for impurity has not been thrown on him, he is unclean. So Jesus is telling them that you are what? You are throwing this is significant to the Pharisees, isn't it? Because of their, how they are about making sure they have whitewashed tombs and everything looks just right as it deals with cleanliness and dealing with those. But by not putting a marker down, what are you doing? You're putting a stumbling block in front of others, aren't you? You're allowing them to walk into a place that is unclean and become unclean without knowing it. And then to end this, at Matthew 6, verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven.
Kim, the rest of the New Testament?
All right. I was talking to a couple men about the topics that we were assigned for the series, And I was wondering when I was assigned greed if Carrie had a camera set up outside my house observing how many times the Amazon truck stopped by each day. Now, to be fair, they're not all mine, but to be honest, today I was receiving a package and I kept hitting refresh to see where it was. I imagine that everybody in the audience can agree that greed is bad. Greed is one of those things that I think is very, very easy to identify in others, but it may be something that is a little hard to admit that we have in ourselves. I think that's because we have a tendency of shrugging off greed by comparing ourselves with those who appear richer than we are and thinking that greed is the richest problem. And we might think like, well, when I make my first million, I'll worry about it. One of the definitions of greed that I'm going to use comes from Colossians. And we need to realize that Paul, when he wrote Colossians, he's writing it to average Christians in an average small town church. And he told them in Colossians chapter 3 that they must put to death their sinful nature in regards to greed, which he equated to being idolatry. If greed was a problem for them in that culture, it's surely a problem for us in our prosperous nation. And we must come to grips and be conscious of how greed can inch its way or creep into our lives. So then the question is, are we being greedy by living in nice, spacious homes furnished with all the conveniences of modern life, when in no doubt on the way to church, I'm sure I passed several people that were homeless. Are we being greedy when we have nice cars in our driveways and expensive toys in our houses and our garages? Where should we draw the line? And how can we keep greed from becoming an idol or becoming our God? So what is greed? The Bible uses several words for greed. One of them is, and I know I'm going to just mess this up, is covetousness. I said it right. Good. Covetousness. Another definition that the Bible uses comes from 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. Love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And other definitions in the word meanings in the Bible, I think we've already talked about, is to literally have more. But it's often used in the sense of taking advantage of another person. But the main sense is desire to have more and more things in an attempt to satisfy ourselves. Often we associate greed with money, but greed isn't always just confined to money. If we consider the story of King David appears to have been greedy for his conquest when he indulged in an adulterous affair with Bathsheba. To cover his greed and betrayal, the king resorted to deceit, attempted trickery, and eventually orchestrated Bathsheba's husband's death on the battlefield. The affair wasn't a simple case of lust, as Nathan's parable about the man with many, many sheep who took the poor man's solitary sheep illustrated. It was at his heart an act of greed. Greed is not primarily concerned with amount, but rather with our attitude and our motives. Greed puts the wrong value on the wrong things. It treats temporal things as if they, and we will endure on this earth forever. But in fact, we could die today, and our things could all be gone in an instant. There's no such thing as financial security in this world. Greed treats eternal things as if they aren't real and never will happen. But when we're in eternity, the speck of time we call life will seem like a blip on the radar screen. So we need to ask ourselves, in the light of eternity, and the brevity of this uncertainty of this life, am I managing what God has entrusted to me so that I am rich towards God? So another question is, how should Christians view greed and wealth? Paul says that greed is the same as idolatry, and it brings wrath. If we look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, it says, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." And again, that's Colossians chapter 3, verse 5. We see that Paul repeats this almost in its entirety in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 10, and Ephesians chapter 5, verse 5. He warns, in both of those passages, he warns the greedy will not inherit the kingdom of God. What Paul is saying is that those lives are characterized by greed are not true believers. So Paul goes on in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 to give another stark warning about greed. "But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pains." These verses emphasize the deceptive nature of greed, which promises fulfillment but ultimately leads to spiritual and moral downfall. When individuals prioritize wealth and material possessions above all else, they can be consumed by greed, leading to a variety of unethical and harmful behaviors. This can include exploitation of others, dishonesty, and neglect of spiritual and moral values. Furthermore, this pursuit of wealth at all costs can lead to a lack of contentment and dissatisfaction in one's lives. This constant desire for more can lead to a never-ending cycle of striving for material gain, often at the expense of relationships, health, and personal well-being. Paul's warning in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10 serves as a reminder to guard ourselves against the love of money and to prioritize spiritual values over material wealth. It encourages contentment with what one has and a recognition of the fleeting nature of material possessions. By heeding Paul's warning, individuals can avoid the pitfalls of greed and materialism, leading to a more fulfilling and balanced life. It reminds us to use wealth as a tool for good, rather than allowing it to become a stumbling block in our spiritual journey. So if greed is idolatry, and the love of money is a gateway to sin, does that mean that we should take a vow of poverty and get rid of all of our possessions? How should we as Christians view wealth? The Bible views wealth as a serious responsibility to do good. All wealth comes from God as a gift entrusted to us to use properly for Him. We are free to enjoy without guilt the wealth that God gives us. We have to remember that we also are stewards of it for Him. In Paul's counsel to Timothy, he talks about it in chapter 6, verse 17 and 18. And I think that also applies to us. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. While hard work is the normal means God uses to bestow wealth, we should never think that we are the cause of our own success or that God owes it to us. Moses warned Israel before they went into Canaan, and we can see that in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 18. And also in the covenant that God promised to bless Israel in Genesis chapter 12, God blesses us with wealth so that we can bless others. The Bible views wealth as good, but something that we should be cautious with. If we're careful to be good stewards of God's gift of wealth, using to promote his purposes, it's good. But if we're deceived by our wealth, so that our trust shifts from the Lord and onto our riches, or we squander it in selfish living without regard for God's purposes, we are in danger of spiritual ruin.
We can learn lots of things from big brothers, not always good. So I remember as a little kid going Halloween candy getting, trick-or-treating with my older brother. And we got back to his room at night and we dumped it out all on the floor, and he convinced me that there was a tax involved in his going with me. So I got one piece of candy and he got 4. I got back at him because the next day when he was gone, I went in and I think I ate every single piece of candy, and I was sure to leave every single wrapper back in the container that he tried to teach me tax fraud. Is greed, is a way to define greed, what mine is mine and what yours is mine. Out of the American way. So Wayne, what verses can you think of in the Old Testament that help separate what we as Christians feel from what the world feels about greed and money?
I won't read the passage completely, but let me reference Numbers chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. We know the story of the Israelites. It's throughout the Old Testament. They were people who were given everything, the promised land and all, but they had to have more. In this particular situation in the 11th chapter, they were dealing with greed. And as they dealt with greed, they found out it didn't please God. And constantly comparing ourselves to others and coveting what they have is a form of greed. It was foolishness for them to think, well, let's go back and be slaves again. We'll go back into Egypt, and look, we had all those good things from the garden, and we did all these great things. Let's be slaves again. Well, foolishness. We can get into that mindset when we want what the neighbors have or other family members have. It creates division, creates bitterness from within. Another consequential offspring of greed is entitlement. This is the attitude that we think we deserve more than we have and that others owe us. For instance, I have a college education. Don't I deserve to be catered to? Or I get to break the rules? I want the mansion on the hill. It's the American way. Am I not entitled to it? Hence, the attitude of greed. It will slip up on us very quickly. Joseph's brothers from the Old Testament came from the heritage of Abraham. Were they not entitled to generous legacy? Weren't the Jews better than the Gentiles? We've been studying a lot about that. Were they not more entitled to the promises of God? We're members of the Lord's church. Doesn't that mean something that we can lavish over people? Greed is one of the most destructive emotions that a person can experience, as it's expressed in God's Word. It leads to a never-ending cycle of raving and dissatisfaction. It can cause a person to lie, to cheat, to steal, in order to get what they want. Greed can also lead to feelings of envy, as it did in the case of Joseph, jealousy, and resentment. Again, that family had just about all of this. So I think the Old Testament is very descriptive of what it's like even to us today.
Gary, same question.
Okay, this is a quote, not from me. I'm not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for the lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. It's probably familiar to some film buffs around here. Those were the words of Gordon Gekko that Michael Douglas played in the 1987 film Wall Street. He was the poster boy for an unharnessed greed, echoing the sentiment of rational free market economics. He viewed greed as not only an inevitable aspect of human nature, but ultimately a desirable one. Well, I have to say he's probably right about the first part of that it's a part of human nature, but certainly not desirable. Kerry mentioned earlier about the American dream. The term American dream was coined in a book from 1931 that was titled The Epic of America. It was written by James Truslow Adams, and he described it as that dream of a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each according to the ability and their achievement. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, does it? Man has a propensity to morph things that are good and useful for their own desires, don't they? So what do we hear when we read from the life of Christ? In Luke 12, following the woes to the Pharisees that we just talked about, we had additional questions that show up. Someone in the crowd, this is verse 13 of chapter 12, said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide their inheritance with me." But Jesus said, "Man, who made me a judge or the arbiter over you?" You think that question came from a sense of concern about his brother or somebody else, or maybe for himself? So in verse 15, Jesus went on to say, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." He told them a parable. We're running a little short on time. We won't go through the whole parable. It happens to be the one about the rich man who came, and he told him that the land had been, he had really good crops. Notice that he says the land provided the crops. And what should he do with him? And of course, Jesus told him in response to tearing down his barns and building a new one, he said, "This night your soul is required for you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" In verse 21, "So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God." I think this just points out the fact that the things that we see, the things that we talked about that were identified in the American dream in itself were warped. When the inner self, going back to Luke chapter 11, when the inner self, the thoughts, the desires, the values of the heart are not aligned with Christ's, then we run into the greed situation, which is a tool for Satan.
So in the New Testament, money and greed are often portrayed in very different ways between the world's perspective and Christians and the Christian's perspective. While the world often values wealth and material possessions as symbols of success and security, The New Testament offers a countercultural view, emphasizing the dangers of greed and the importance of a proper attitude towards money. In the worldview, money and possessions are often seen as primary sources of happiness and fulfillment. Wealth is pursued as a means of achieving status, power, and comfort. The world's view of money often leads to greed, which is condemned, as we talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. Greed can also be characterized as an insatiable desire for more wealth and possessions, often at the expense of others. This mindset is, as we can all agree, contrary to the teachings of Jesus, who emphasized the importance of generosity and selflessness. In contrast to the world's view, Christians are called to adopt a different perspective on money and greed. We are encouraged to be content and view wealth as a gift from God and to be used for his glory and the benefit of others. This perspective is captured in 1 Timothy chapter 6, 17 and 19. Furthermore, Christians are called to be content with what they have, trusting in God's provision. We see Paul instructing Timothy in that manner if we look at verses 6 and 8. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing with these, we will be content. The New Testament offers a clear contrast between the world's view of money and greed and the Christian view. While the world sees wealth as a source of happiness and fulfillment, Christians are called to view money as a tool to be used for God's purposes and to be content with what we have. By adopting this perspective, we can avoid the pitfalls of greed and find true satisfaction and a life lived for God's glory.
Okay, we're running out of time, or we've run out of time, so I'm actually going to summarize real quickly. Sorry, guys. So my question for Wayne was, what other areas, and we kind of talked about it's not just money. To Carrie, I asked, is it wrong to be rich? And no, it's not wrong to be rich. It's how we go about being rich. And if it consumes our lives, then obviously it's not good. And then the last thing is, if we find ourselves being greedy, what can we do to bring ourselves back? And I think the key is twofold, in that we remember that everything is God's. Everything is God's. And the second thing is, it's more important to be selfless than to be selfish. So next week we're going to be talking about war and peace. It's a really lighthearted subject. So hope you can join us back. We'll have a prayer and be dismissed. Father in heaven, we do thank you for this avenue that we have to talk to each other, to work together, to read from your word, to learn about ways that you want us to be in our lives. We know that you want us to be selfless and not selfish, and you want us to be able to always be able to tell the world that you are our God, and that is the best thing we can be. We thank you most of all for your son on the cross. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. That's a great point.
Sorry I stole your thunder, but we were hurting for time a little bit. So I just summarized you real quick.
Good job, guys. When we lived in Connecticut, there was a lady, someone said about, keeping up with the Joneses. Oh, right. And she said, I don't worry about keeping up with the Joneses. The Joneses have to worry about keeping up with me. That's not the right attitude to have.
Sounds like they were pretty well off.
I tried everything out. Yeah.
I would have died laughing.